Hey there, drone fans. Rick here again from Drone Valley. Today's clip is part 2 in the series I'm calling Anatomy of a Flyaway. And in today's segment, I'm going to cover some of the mechanical things you need to be aware of that could cause your quad to misbehave when it's up in the air. Now, before I get too deep into this, just like I said in part 1, flyaways are an incredibly rare thing. It's probably something you'll never experience if you fly the rest of your life, but for some reason, flyaways get a lot of press. People love to put YouTube clips up talking about them, about how the drone lost its mind and it flew off on me. They're extremely rare events, and I spend a lot of time around really experienced pilots and even new pilots, and whenever I hear a story start about a flyaway, I want to talk to that pilot, and I want to hear the story, but again, as a nerd and as an engineer, I want to find out what you were doing exactly when that flyaway took place. There's something in there that I'm not hearing, and I'll analyze logs and I'll talk to the pilots, and if they're being totally honest, it's usually pilot error. It's either something they're doing while they're flying that they knew they shouldn't be doing, or it's something they didn't do before they took off, because the modern quads that are out there today are incredibly sophisticated machines, and the engineers that build these sweat the details. They think about things like redundancy and sensors and how can I make it safer, and they're incredibly sophisticated devices. So the chances of the quad itself causing the flyaway are pretty rare, because when you think about the equation of a whole lot of brilliance here, a transmission topology that's rock solid in most cases, and the person flying it, you're easily the dumbest thing in that equation. So pilots do goofy things, or they don't prepare, because when you're out there as a pilot, just like being a diver, I used to be a diver for a lot of years, you don't get a second chance 80 feet down in the water. You've really got to make sure all your equipment is working topside and it's been checked out and it's been routinely maintenance done on it. So when you get down there at 80 feet, you've got confidence in your equipment. It's the same exact thing with the drone, and you've got it 90 feet in the air or 200 feet in the air. So what I'm going to talk about today from a mechanical perspective are two single points of failure in every quad that's flying today: the propulsion system and the power plant. Now you may be thinking, if these fail, the quad's coming down out of the sky, and that's absolutely true. So there are fatal failures that can happen with these single points of failure, but there are other things that can happen that will cause the quad to misbehave. So you're mistreating the quad in some ways by not taking the steps that I'm going to talk about in this clip today. And again, all of the things I'm going to talk about today are completely in your control. So if you're worried about a flyaway, learn what I'm going to tell you today and make sure you do these things every time before you take off, and you're going to be just fine. So stay tuned, and I'm going to get into propulsion first, then I'm going to talk about power plant second, and I'm going to give you some rock solid suggestions based on all the issues I've had, all the conversations I've had with other pilots, and I'm going to get to the root cause of why those flyaways took place. And again, turns out it's pilot error. So stay tuned and we'll get into it. In this first section, I'll cover some of the mechanical things that I've learned over the years that you should be checking before you ever put your quads up in the sky that will help you pretty much eliminate any chance of a flyaway based on these factors. But I wanted to start this section off with just a brief history of flight, because it's one of those things that really shouldn't happen. I've talked about these products being miracles. Flight in general is something that almost defies the laws of physics, and as a nerd, a few things get me really excited: technology and physics. And these products combine both of those. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how these things fly, because honestly, as an engineer, I don't think they should be here. These are products that shouldn't be available to the general public at this point, because this technology should be 10 or 15 years away from us. But here it is today. So when we think about flight, as humans, we've constantly thought about how do we get up there? Not just how do we get up there, but how do we stay up there? Because we're essentially terrestrial creatures. We walk around on the ground, we can go forward and back, we can go left and right. We're two-dimensional creatures, and okay, you can get to the third dimension on a pogo stick or a trampoline for a couple of seconds, but to get up there and stay up there, that's a tough thing to do. And forever, since the beginning of time, the dawn of time, we as a species have quested to get up there in the sky and stay up there. And it started way back thousands of years ago with the Chinese, who were really the first ones to put kites in the air, that understood to a certain extent how wind could keep something up in the air. And that controlled flight with a string was pretty basic back then, but it wasn't really something that got them up in the air. You couldn't build a big enough kite where you'd get up in the air. So the next big evolution came from what we'll call lighter than air craft. And that started with people understanding that if you heat air, air rises, hot air rises. So if I can capture that inside of some container, a balloon for example, and capture enough of it, put a basket underneath it with a really skinny person in it, I could probably lift them into the sky. The problem with lighter than aircraft, especially balloons, is that there's not a lot of control with those. So when the balloon goes up, you're kind of a slave to the wind at that point. So you've got to have a chase vehicle on the ground or somebody on a horse, I guess back in those days, to chase the balloon. So when it came down somewhere, you could actually pick that person up and bring them home. Now, the first people that really kind of mastered balloons in general were the French. The French really loved their balloons. They had a balloon force during the Revolution, and they were the ones that really bought into this whole balloon theory and spent a lot of time developing balloons. The next big evolution in lighter than air transportation came with the Germans and the invention of the dirigibles, or the Zeppelins, those larger airships that used chemicals. They used hydrogen, they used helium to sort of lift that up in the air, and it was very, very big. And they were really the first ones that decided, we're going to put some kind of control mechanism on it, so we're not a slave to the wind anymore, where we're drifting all over the place. We can actually control it with a couple of rudders on the back and a small engine to kind of push it through the air in a certain direction. And I love that word dirigible. That's something I use a lot. I think that's a cool word. But the Germans came up with that. But again, it still wasn't a completely controllable craft. It was something that you had some level of control over, but it was extremely dangerous. Obviously, the Hindenburg was an issue that we all remember from kids. But beyond that, it was difficult to control it. So the big epiphany came after years and years of brilliant people, thousands of years of development, back since the Chinese time to today, where all those developments around Newton's third law of motion, fluid dynamics, aeronautical investigations about lift and control of things in the air came from people like Da Vinci and a ton of brilliant engineers all over the world. All of that led up to that fateful day in 1903 when Orville and Wilbur Wright took that first flight on Devil's Kill Hill in that airplane that they built. And it was a 12-second flight that changed everything. That was the first sustainable, controlled, populated, somebody was on the plane, flight. And it was an epiphany. Now, that's not what we're doing today. Obviously, we've come light years since then in the last 100 years. You can get on an airplane today. Most people don't even think about it. But the mechanics of the physics that were going on inside that airplane are brilliant. And technology's invaded that space in a big way. So most planes today are flown through technology. They've got digital controls inside the planes. All of this is controlled by digital electronics today. So, you know, good on those guys, Orville and Wilbur. But what I like so much about them too, just as a side note, is as engineers, they were sort of working through this. They were bicycle guys. They were working through this and went through hundreds and hundreds of iterations, and they would constantly go back and tweak this and tweak that and test things. And that's what engineers do. They want to sort of move the ball forward little by little. It's a game of inches to get it to where you need it to be. And they built their own wind tunnels, and they were doing aerodynamic tests against it to see how the airflow went across the top of the wings. And that's something any engineer would do. The thing I love about them, though, is they were so concerned, in addition to the technology, with safety, because one of their main driving forces was to say, forever people have been jumping out of balloons with sort of crude wings that they're flapping, trying to see if they can get flying, or they've been shot out of cannons. We don't want to do that, because all those people get hurt or worse, killed, because they jumped off a cliff and it didn't work. We want to focus on safety as well. So they were of the mind of, like, we want the technology to advance, but we want you to get off the airplane when it's done. So they focused on safety and minimizing the chances of loss of life or limb. They don't want arms being broken and legs being broken. So two heroes of mine right there. I think the engineering side really intrigues me, but that safety side is really important as well. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because these modern quads have a tremendous amount of safety gear built into them. The engineers that built these are standing on the shoulders of giants that invented a lot of the flight characteristics that these take advantage of, but the technology inside these exploits that to the point where they're making them safe. And I'd mentioned before, redundant components, redundant paths, all kinds of self-checking going on inside there when you go through a power-on self-test. So they're very, very sophisticated devices, and that's why I get frustrated when I hear people say, I had a Flyaway, the quad did it. The quad probably didn't do it. It's probably something you didn't pay attention to. So I'll get into that in a second. Now, the two things you want to concern yourself with around propulsion are what I'm going to call integrity and posture. Now, integrity has to do with, is the propeller in good enough shape to fly? Is it going to behave up in the air? Is it doing what the ESCs and the motors are expecting? The posture has to do with wear of that propeller over time, because even though the propeller looks good, it may not be up to spec to fly, and I'll tell you how to check both of those. So let's start with the integrity of the propeller. So the first thing you want to do before you fly, and I do this every time I go out to fly, not every flight, but a beautiful Saturday afternoon, I'm driving out to a location to fly. First thing I'll do, pull all four propellers off your quad. Run your fingers along the edges. Make sure there's no nicks or dings or gouges along those. If they're nice and smooth, run them across the top surface. You can use a cotton ball if you want to bring a couple of those with you. You'll find if there's any nicks or rubs on the top of it. Once you're sure they're smooth, clean them off, because when you're flying up there, you're in a very debris-laden environment. You're flying through bugs, you're flying through particles and dust and dirt. They're going to get dirty, they're going to get gunked up over time. So what I do is carry one of these alcohol wipes with me that you can use to clean your glasses, and I'll run them across all the propellers to make sure that I get all that gunk and bug juice off them, and then I'm in pretty good shape. The one thing you want to be really careful of, and a lot of people miss this if you don't pull the prop off, is that the biggest point of torque on any propeller is right here in the center. So when you spin this, that torque of it actually turning and stopping and turning creates a tremendous amount of stress on the locking mechanism that holds the propeller onto the quad. Now again, if it fails completely, propeller flies off, drone's coming down, but a flyaway can be caused by behavior that's unexpected by the controller inside the quad. So every quad you've got out there has got some type of mechanism that holds the propeller onto the motor. In this case, I've got 3 fingers coming up from the motor that are bolted onto the motor. You want to make sure those fingers are intact. You want to make sure that you're not missing one or one isn't loose or cracked, and you wouldn't notice that unless you pulled the propeller off. So pull the propeller off, check those fingers. If you're using a quad like this, well, I've got one here, the fingers are actually on the propeller itself, and the mating mechanism's on the motor. So again, check these to make sure they're good. I've talked to pilots, actually this one right here is missing the third one, and they don't typically fall off, they'll crack. And if they crack, the propeller is going to wobble on that quad. Now, the reason that can cause a flyaway, well, let me explain the 3 types of propellers first. So there are rigid propellers like this, and again, you want to check the surfaces and make sure you're good. The newer quads like this, the folding type quads, use these folding propellers, and the reason for that is you can fold them up and make it nice and tight. When you open up these to fly, they're going to go out to a full-size propeller that looks pretty much like a fixed propeller here. One recommendation I would have is don't let the quad open those propellers. I'm guilty of it. I fly all the time, and a lot of times I'm anxious to get that perfect shot of the sunset. I've checked everything is good to go. Propellers are folded. I'll bring the joysticks down to the middle, I'll spin it up, and the propellers flatten out. Try not to do that, only because the stress you're causing to have these things fly out at speed puts a tremendous amount of stress on this pivot point in the center, because you've got one piece here that adheres down to the motor, and you've got rivets that actually hold these blades onto that centerpiece. Over time, they're going to fatigue. Now, that comes down to posture. So here I've got a folding propeller. It's a good thing to check. Folding propeller that's standing out straight. This is a brand new propeller. I can shake it. It's only moving down a tiny bit. Here's a propeller that I've been flying with for a couple of weeks. You can tell already, see how it's dipping? When I shake that, see how it's dropping down? That's a real good indication that those attachment points, those rivets inside there, are getting weak and they're getting sloppy, and that's going to cause a tiny bit of vibration in the propeller over time. It's going to give you issues. All right, the third type of propeller is the split propeller here, and these are used on some of the smaller quads. The new Mavic Mini uses these, and these are attached to the motor directly with screws. And those screws or bolts that screw down in the motor have a tiny bit of Loctite in the end of them. So if you're going to change these propellers, I always recommend take both propellers off at the same time, change them in pairs, throw them out, take the screws out, throw them out as well, because the new screws that come with the replacement propellers have Loctite on them. And the way Loctite works is as you crank down on that bolt, the heat of that compression actually turns that into glue that'll set that screw down there, and it'll hold it in the position. Over time, if you don't have that Loctite down there, that screw can work its way out a little bit, and then these guys start flapping. Now, the reason you don't want to have any kind of flapping in the propellers is because when you think about a quad, let's talk about an airplane first. So an airplane is basically an engine that's pulling itself through the air, and it's got a craft attached to it, but it's pulling it forward, and it's got a horizontal surface on the side. Those are the wings, and you've got some control over elevation and descension by flapping those wings, the flaps on the side of the wings. On the tail, you've got a rudder. If you turn that, you can control side-to-side motion, and your forward motion is controlled by the engine. Now, you can't back up in an airplane, but you basically got 3 dimensions of control: forward, left and right, up and down. With these guys, you've actually got, when you think about it, 4 airplanes, single-engine airplanes, strapped together. These are single-engine airplanes. So imagine the complexity of not only strapping 4 airplanes together to get them to coordinate in their behavior, but then turning them this way. So you've got vertical airplanes that are flying like this with propellers up in the sky. So the same aerodynamics and principles of physics apply to flight on this as it does with the airplanes, but some unique things are happening here. So for example, these 2 propellers are spinning in the same direction, and these are spinning in the opposite direction, because you always have to have counterbalancing to maintain a position in 3D space. So the speed at which those propellers spin determine whether the quad is sitting still or it's moving in a particular direction. So for example, if you want to go this direction, you'll spin these 2 a little bit faster, and you'll spin these 2 a little bit slower. The quad will dip forward and move in this direction. If you want to go towards the camera, you'll spin these a little slower, these a little faster, and it'll dip that direction. Well, all that coordination, that sophisticated coordination of maintaining a level position in the sky and moving in the direction you want, is really handled by the flight controller inside the unit, which is a brilliant brain that's got programming in it that says, I'm checking my IMU, I'm checking GPS and all the other instruments I've got, my gyros, and I'm going to move in this direction. Now to do that, I'm going to spin you guys a little faster and you a little slower based on your joystick movements. Well, all that works great normally. The problem is, if you've got a propeller that isn't up to spec, you've got a problem with integrity or posture, that propeller is not behaving the way the speed controller, which is driving the motor, or the controller, the main flight controller, expects it to. And the flight controller is going to look at that and say, you guys spin faster, you guys spin slower. If this guy's spinning really slow, the ESC is going to tell that controller, hey, I'm not spinning as fast as I should. What are you going to do about that? The flight controller is going to spin that faster. It's going to try and spin it faster. The problem is, if it can't keep up with this guy, it's going to drift. And drift is a flyaway, so it's going to drift in the direction of the weaker propeller. Now again, you've got to have some pretty dramatic damage to the propellers to cause that, but over time you can definitely damage a quad by having sloppy propellers, causing damage to the ESCs, or in some cases, if they're damaged enough, you'll get a flyaway. It's not like the quad is actively flying in that direction, it's mostly drifting in that direction because the internal flight controller and the ESCs that actually drive the motor are thinking that it's got to spin faster to get it in that direction and it can't keep up with that spin. So the propellers, the propulsion behind it, are super critical. And again, if they fail, it's coming down out of the sky. That's extremely rare. Unless you broke it or you didn't pay attention to it, more often than not, they get sloppy over time. So check them. If you see any kind of nicks or dings in the rigid propellers, change them. If you've got any kind of slop with this, like again, that's a new one. This is one that I've been flying with for a while. You can see the difference right there. Look how sloppy that is, right? Chuck it. And I know they're not cheap. They're a couple of bucks, but replace the propellers because even though these might be 10 or 15 bucks a set, it's $1,000 quad. So getting these off the quad, making sure you've got great integrity and great posture of propellers before you take off is super important. If you damage them, change them as sets. Again, these split propellers have to be changed as sets. With these, you can change individual propellers if you want. You might want to change the pair at the same time, but it's totally up to you there. But that's pretty much the stuff that'll cause flyaways from a mechanical perspective in the propulsion category. And again, when I analyze the logs of flyaways that have occurred, and it's some kind of weird flyaway, and I look in the logs and I can see the 4 ESCs were all running about the same, and for some reason at this one particular moment in the flight, this ESC kind of overdrove the motor, then we know for sure that something weird was going on with that propeller, which is the one part that's going to keep it up in the sky. So that's pretty much it for propulsion. Check your propellers, and the rule of thumb that I use is give your props the once over before you ever fly for the day. You don't have to do it on every flight, but when you walk out on the Saturday morning and you want to get up in the sky, just take a minute as a responsible pilot, check the propellers. Once they're good to go, you're going to feel a lot more confident flying your quad. Now stay tuned, and I'm going to get into the battery concerns next when I talk about the power plant. This final section of mechanical concerns that I'd like to cover as part of this clip deals with the power plant for your quad, which is essentially the battery. It's a container that holds a lot of electrons, it holds a big charge, and provides all the power the drone needs to stay up in the air. Now that power is used for navigation, for control, for GPS coordination, for telemetry information, for video streaming, to drive the motors. All of that is super critical, so you can imagine how important that battery is to proper flight with the quad. Now obviously if a battery fails, which is extremely rare, the quad's going to come out of the sky like a rock, but more often than not, batteries don't fail. They don't blink out like a light bulb in the dark at night. They may have issues, and that's what I'm going to get into now. And you might be thinking, well, isn't that really an electrical issue? It is, and I'm going to cover that in the next clip, but there are some mechanical things that can impact the battery's ability to supply the right amount of current and voltage to the quad at the right time to keep it up in the air. And if something goes a little bit sketchy with the battery, it could lead to a situation where the drone gets confused when it's flying, and that may lead to a flyaway. So there are a couple of things I'm going to talk about with the battery, and I'll get into those individually. The first thing I'm going to talk about is dirty contacts, which is something we all suffer through. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is poor seating. Now they've solved a lot of those problems in newer batteries, but it's important to understand exactly how these cells work. So to get started, first off, the batteries in these quads are miracles of chemistry. They really are. Some of these newer batteries that are used in the modern quads are based on fairly exotic chemistries like lithium polymer and some other technologies that are rechargeable. So they're reversible charges where you can actually load it up with a bunch of electrons and have it stored in that battery for a period of time. It's a tremendous amount of energy density. So for the size of that battery, the amount of potential it provides to the quad is something that without the invention of these LiPo cells, you wouldn't be flying these quads very long at all, because if you just slapped a couple of D-cell batteries in them, you might get a minute or two out of flight because they drink a lot of electrons. So these batteries are incredibly important, and the invention of lithium polymer technology goes back quite a long time, and it's being being used in things like cars today. Tesla uses it, a lot of self-driving cars use it, but for quads, it provides the perfect balance of weight and energy density to get these guys up in the air. But normally batteries are sort of charged, put in the quad, and then you fly them till they're dead, and the quad keeps track of that. So in earlier versions of the quad, you would plug the battery in, and the quad would keep track of what level of charge it's got left and sort of make a rough approximation of how long you could fly. What's happened in later generations of quads, all the modern quads, is that the batteries themselves have gotten a lot smarter. So before these intelligent batteries came out, you'd have to have a really smart charger that could charge a dumb battery. Now what you've got is the intelligence is built into the battery, so you can have a dumb charger and just fire electrons at these batteries, and the controller inside the battery will monitor how it's being charged, how it's being discharged. It's gathering all kinds of metrics on how many times it's been charged, the temperature, the voltage it's using, the current it's delivering to the quad, and it's reporting it to the quad on a regular basis. So in essence, you've got a power plant that's intelligent, that's monitoring itself during the flight, and it's reporting that information back to the quad. And then the quad looks at that information and says, okay, based on what you're telling me, we can still fly for 11 minutes and still have enough power left to get back home. The challenge with the mechanical aspects of this are that if the connection isn't good, or the connection gets broken, or the connection is dirty and can't deliver the amount of current the quad needs, all kinds of strange things can happen because the voltage that the quads use to keep track of where they are in a 3D space has to be consistent, and it has to be available all the time. So I'm going to talk about two aspects that can get you in trouble with the batteries or the power plants if you're not careful. The first one has to do with dirty contacts, and the second one has to do with seating issues, which is less of an issue in some of the newer quads based on the way they hold the batteries in the quads, but it's still an issue you have to contend with. So I'm looking at 3 different generations of batteries here. These are all DJI products, but initially what you had was a battery like this that was intelligent. That's out of an early Phantom product, and you had 2 connections to the battery. So you basically had a left and a right, a positive and negative connection, and you had a small connection over here that was used for communication between the internal electronics of the battery and the quad. So when you slid this into the quad, you made a power connection here, which were pretty substantial because it's beefy, it's drawing a lot of current, and you had the intelligent connection made here. That wasn't redundant enough. So what they've done in newer quads is they've increased the number of lines that supply power to the quad, and they've also upped the intelligence inside the battery. So the generation moving forward to the Phantom products, the Phantom 4 products, is they made the battery a lot smarter, and they also increased the number of connections on the battery. So if you look along the bottom of the battery, even something newer like the Mavic Air 2, you've got 10 connections on there. And you might be thinking, well, what the heck would you need 10 connections for? I'm just basically applying 12 volts, 13 volts to the drone. Why do I need all those connections? Well, if you do some investigation, and I'm a nerd, so I like doing this stuff, you'll find that the outside 4 connections are how they deliver power. So you've got negative along one end, 4 of them, and positive along the other end, 4 of them, which leaves 2 in the middle. Now, the first question you'd have, and I had this question, why would I need 4 connections? Can't I just supply 2 connections, one for positive and one for negative? You can. The challenge there is if that connection gets dirty or it gets broken or it gets tarnished, you can't really deliver the amount of current you need to the quad to have it fly correctly. So again, engineers like to be redundant. They've built in 4 different connections to supply an even stream of current to that quad. And I'm betting, and I don't know this to be the fact, but I've got to test it, I'm betting that each of those connections carry more than 25% of that current, because to have redundancy, I'd want to lose one of those connections and still be able to deliver all the power I need to fly that quad. So I'm sure there's redundancy built in, but anyway, that's why you've got 8 of those connections. The 2 middle connections are how the intelligent controller inside the battery actually communicates to the quad. And that's super important to understand because the quad doesn't really know what's going on with the battery outside of what's being reported to it by that internal controller. So if you've got dirty contacts, the first thing that's going to cause is it's going to reduce the amount of current that can be supplied by the battery. And that's kind of an interesting situation because the controller thinks it's got a full battery charge, but because the contacts are dirty, that full charge can't be delivered to the quad. So the quad's assuming it's got a full charge, but it's got less than full voltage coming to the quad, which is going to cause all kinds of bizarre things going on with the quad. It may affect the compass, it may affect the IMU or the gyros. At the very least, it's going to cause the quad to do things you're not expecting. So the way you get into trouble on that is, and I thought this was a poor design the minute they released it, is you've got contacts on the bottom of the battery. Now, habit would tell you if you pull it out of the quad and you're swapping batteries, you've got a heavy battery, you're going to set it down on the ground. And when you set it down on the ground, guess what's going to happen? Dirt, debris, all kinds of stuff's going to get up inside these contacts. Now, if you have the presence of mind to clean that off immediately and blow it out, you'll probably be okay. But if you let that moisture and the dirt and debris sit there for any length of time, over time that's going to tarnish those contacts, it's going to build up the resistance, and then when you slide it back in the drone, you're going to transfer all that debris to your drone. So you've not only damaged the battery, but you're going to damage your drone over time. So it's super important that you never set this down on its end, on a table or any kind of surface at all, especially the ground, because you're going to pick up a ton of debris. So what I recommend with all the batteries, and I'm a little bit conservative about this, but this is a huge investment. So in the case of the Mavic Air 2, the drone's $800, the battery's $115. So if you buy 2 batteries, that's 25% the cost of the quad. I want to protect that like it's gold. So what I like to do with my batteries is when I'm traveling with them, I use battery protectors across the contacts, and they're just simple rubber stoppers that we sell on this website, but they're custom made for each of the batteries. And essentially what they do is cover up the actual connections on the battery. So this way you can put these rubber stoppers on, and when you put it down, if you put it on the ground, you're not going to get dirt inside there. It's also great if you're going to put it in your car, put it on the floor, you've got it in a bag with you or a backpack, you're not going to get debris up inside the contacts. The second thing you have to be concerned about is you want to make sure that if these batteries go nonlinear, because lipochemistry can be fairly finicky out there. It doesn't like heat, it doesn't like cold, it doesn't like to get pierced. So if you break into the contacts on this, or you break through the side of this, and those chemicals get exposed to air, you could have spontaneous combustion. So the second thing I do is when I'm traveling with these batteries, I'll throw them inside a fire retardant bag like this, a lipo safety bag, and that protects the contacts on the end, I don't get debris on them, and I've got it in a bag that's protected where I'm not going to have issues if it decides to go nonlinear. But back to the contacts. So first off, if they get dirty, it's going to reduce the amount of current that can be supplied to the drone, and you have that sort of split brain scenario going on where the battery's saying, hey, I'm doing fine, I got plenty of charge left, but the drone's trying to drink those electrons and can't get them out of the battery fast enough because of dirty contacts. The second condition, which makes it even more concerning, is if those get dirty enough and the drone's flying through the air and all of a sudden, because it gets jostled because you stopped quickly, you lose contact on one of those, you've got a sort of a micro break in the ability to supply that current to the drone. Well, guess what's going to happen there? Have you ever been home during a power outage, like you've got a storm rolling through like we do tonight, there's lightning and thunder going on? Maybe you don't lose power, but you get a brownout in the house. The first thing that happens is all your electronics start from scratch. They do a reboot. So your computer reboots, your TV will shut off and maybe come back on. Well, that rebooting happens in the drone. So can you imagine having a drone of 300 feet in the air, 1,200 feet downfield, and it reboots? The controller has to go out and assess where it is in the 3D space. It has to reestablish communication with the controller. All the while, it might be flying 20 miles an hour in a certain direction. So that reboot can cause a whole lot of problems with the drone. And when I analyze a lot of the logs where people have had strange things happen, where they land the drones, the prop looks good, and everything's fine with the mechanics of it, and I look at the logs, you're going to see the battery voltage all over the place. And that's usually because you've got dirty contacts on the end. Now, the second place you can get into trouble with drone batteries is around the seating issues. Now, these were pretty good with seating. So they've got double clamps on them. When you slide them in, you'll hear that click. You want to make sure it's all the way in there. So one thing I always say is before you take off, make sure you push it in, you hear the double click, and you give it as much force as necessary to make sure it's fully seated, and that usually works okay for you. The challenge is if you're excited and you've got this great shot and you're chasing, I don't know, you're chasing some falcon someplace out there and you want to get the drone back up because the battery's getting low, you may be too quick with it. So take your time, don't rush through it, make sure the battery's fully seated. But even still, you could have problems with the battery where the chemistry inside, the lipochemistry, over time can degrade. And you get situations where the battery starts to swell. It's just one of those byproducts of lipo technology when you charge it and discharge it so many times. So I always like to check before I go out. After I've charged my batteries on a Saturday morning before I go to fly, I like to do what I call the Roc Test. Now here's a Mavic Air battery, the original Mavic Air. See how that's rocking? That's a flat surface on the bottom, but it's not really. There's a bulge down there, and I put it down on a flat surface, and if it rocks like that, I know I've got issues. Now, all the cells have what I'll call caution zones built into them, where you've got hard plastic and soft plastic where the actual lipo cells are behind it. When these swell, they'll typically swell on those soft surfaces. So in this case, the bottom is the soft surface. And actually, when I look at this closer, there's cracks along the end here. So those cells internally are swelling. Now, the tendency would be, or I should say the temptation would be, to say, it took a charge. How bad could it be? That's a really dangerous thing to do because that indication that it's swelling means this battery's on its way out. Take it out of your quad, take it to a recycling center, and never think about it again. If you push the issue and put it back in your quad, you not only have the chance of it causing problems where it doesn't seat correctly and you get the break in the connection and the controller will reset, but more importantly, it could spontaneously combust and you've not only lost a $90 battery, you've lost an $800 quad. So anytime a battery swells like that, get rid of it. Now, the other thing I'll mention is that good battery hygiene, and this is something I'll I'll use as my catchphrase is maintain good battery hygiene, is always check these contacts on the bottom, because even if you don't set them down on the grass or on the dirt and you're really good about that, if you throw them in a backpack or you throw them in a case, a lot of these cases have foam inside that are cut out for them, and they may not be the greatest quality foam. Over time that foam will break down, or you'll pick up fuzz from a backpack or something and it gets up inside there. So I always carry an old toothbrush, not one I've used, but one that I can use for cleaning these with me, and I'll run that toothbrush along these edges every so often to make sure they're clean. I'll take a good look in there with a flashlight to make sure there's no fuzz or anything, because if you get them dirty and you slide them back into the drone, you've now moved that contamination from the battery of your drone. It's going to give you trouble down the road. So those are the things you want to be aware of. And again, this is amazing technology. The energy density in these batteries is through the roof, so they're fantastic products, but they do require a little bit of care and feeding. And the analogy I'll use is you got to be careful how you charge them and how you discharge them and where you store them. The analogy I like to use is think of it as a brand new puppy that you brought home. You wouldn't leave the puppy in the garage in the cold days. Don't charge your battery in really cold environments. You wouldn't leave the puppy in your car if it was getting hot, right? Because the puppy wouldn't like that. Don't charge your batteries when it's too hot. And if you're going to put them away, store them in an area that's moderate temperature and in a safety container, so that you have issues with them down the road, and God forbid they burst into flames or something, they're inside of a container that can help you prevent that from spreading all over your house. So that's pretty much it with the batteries. The two issues again are dirty contacts, because you're going to get a break in the contacts and can't deliver the current you need to deliver to the drone to keep it in the air. And the second is the seating issue, like I've mentioned with this Mavic Air battery, that I got to get over to the recycling center. Okay, so that's pretty much it for today. I know this was a long clip, and I'm hoping that you guys find value in it. I couldn't rush through it because these topics are so important that they really needed a little extra time to explain them, so you can definitely avoid all these issues and not have to worry about flyaways, because this is a fantastic hobby. And every time I get out in the field and put my drone up for the first time, I'm smiling ear to ear like a 9-year-old at Christmas. I just love it. It enhances my life, and it just changes the perspective you have of the world. So I know you guys are enjoying it just like I am. The one thing you don't want to fear is a flyaway. So take these steps that I've mentioned in this clip and the previous one, and the one that I'm going to do next, to heart, because if you pay attention to these, you take your time as a responsible pilot, make sure your gear's ready to go, you're not going to have these issues with flyaway. So that's pretty much it for today. If there's anything I've covered today that you've got questions on, please drop those in the comments below. I promise to get back to you as quickly as I can. If you need any accessories for your drones, we have a ton of those accessories on the website. If you want to support the channel, hit the website, pick up some of those accessories. We stand behind everything we sell. We ship daily. We can get it to you faster than Amazon. And the last thing I'll mention is, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit that subscribe button down there and join the Drone Valley family, because we have so many more clips coming that talk about technology, comparisons of drones, other high-tech stuff that we like to investigate. And we're also giving a couple of drones away this summer, and you definitely want to be subscribed to the channel to get into those giveaways. And that's pretty much it. So thanks again for watching. We really appreciate your support. And until next time, happy flying.